So without further ado, I actually am excited to invite to stage Oren and Chamath. Oren is, other than his other titles, the one that I like is Icon's co-chair. But he's also known for many other things. And I can't wait to hear the story. So please join us here on stage. Thank you.
And I'm especially excited about this. And apparently not just me. You know, when this was announced, I've never seen such reaction. People emailed me begging for invitations. People who follow you on in the media.
Like an exotic zoo animal that's about to go out of extinction.
It's true. And on the other hand, by the way, I also had some fear, but also some negative reactions. I don't know if it's even people who know you personally, but like negative reactions. So my first thing, and I know I didn't prepare you for that, but first of all, would you agree that you are polarizing? That you are a polarizing figure, and how do you feel about it? Are you comfortable with it? Do you like it? Do you hate it?
Well, I think the answer is that I am a guy on a journey, like a lot of people are. I think my success, if you call it that, then forces me or allows me or has me playing out my evolution a little bit more in the public spotlight than other people. And I think along the way, like a lot of people, I make mistakes and I'm learning. And I think that if it's not just me, but if anybody, if you took a static snapshot of any one of you at any moment in time, it's easy to either completely adore you or completely kind of vilify you. And so I think it's a bit reductive. And I think the more accurate thing is like, there's a person that's going through an evolution, and is that relevant to other people? And in some very specific ways, I think it is quite relevant. And in many ways, it's not.
Okay, that was pretty deep. Thank you.
That's a nice way of telling those people to kiss my ass.
All right. So I actually wasn't going to get into it, but you reminded me. So given the audience, you started your career with some strong Israel connection, right? With AOL, right?
I commuted to Israel once a quarter for 2 years. From the east coast of the United States to Tel Aviv. I used to stay in the David Intercontinental. Every day I took the bus or the car to Kiryat Atidim, and I helped oversee a business called ICQ. And it was an incredible moment because I was a very young person put in a position of leadership. And, you know, at the time, there are these legends and these real heroes in Israeli culture, but also in the early part of Israeli tech, people like Yossi Vardi, who I got to interact with and see be yelled at by.
Must have been a treat.
It was, you know, I have some incredible stories about Yossi Vardi. And so it was a great moment because you got to see this this kind of thriving culture and the resilience. I'll give you just one example. I was like 25 or 26. And I land, I'm staying in this hotel. We go to Jaffa, we eat at this restaurant. And they're like, Chamath, do you like the food? I'm like, yeah. They said, oh, a bomb went off here just 3 days ago. And you're just like shaken to the core of like, what is going on here? And so it just goes to show you, like, there was a level of resiliency and courage and stuff, and I found that really inspiring. So I love going to Israel for the period in which I did, and then for a very long period I didn't, and then yet again when I started Social Capital I was able to go, and then for another long period I didn't, and I just went again 3 years ago.
Oh, cool.
Superb.
Cool. Next time let me know. Maybe I'm going to be there. So, and then I think you had a short VC career at Mayfield, right? But then you joined Facebook,
So
which I think is the
I was working at AOL, and that caused me to move back to the east, or caused me to move to the East Coast. But I really wanted to get back to the West Coast, and I got approached at the time to be a principal at Mayfield Fund, which is sort of one of the original kind of grandfather venture capital organizations here. You know, Sequoia, Mayfield, there was a few others. And I took the job because I had always wanted to be an investor. I never wanted to be an executive. I never wanted to be an entrepreneur. I had always wanted to allocate capital from as long as I can remember. And I'd always thought about everything as investing or bets and probabilities. It was just kind of wired into me. So I took the job, but it was interesting because it was an organization that was really on the back half of their greatness.
Yeah.
And they were coming to terms with the mortality of their partners, but also just how brittle the success in Silicon Valley could be, and the waves of innovation and missing them. And so I learned a lot, but I was only there for 6 months, just right until I could get my green card, and then I went to Facebook.
Yeah, by the way, Chamath is Canadian, so...
Born in Sri Lanka until I was 7, and then grew up in Canada, so I've been a citizen of 3 countries.
Right.
Yeah.
So how did you land this Facebook opportunity? What was the circumstances like?
It goes back to when I was running, before I ran the AIM and ICQ businesses, I was a senior product manager and then, you know, mid-level director in the music businesses of AOL. And we had these businesses called Spinner and Winamp. And we operated in a building in San Francisco that housed a bunch of other music startups, and one of them was Napster. So me and Sean Parker became pretty good friends. So then fast forward 3 years later, he and I had done a deal when he was working at LinkedIn. Then he joined Facebook, sorry, not LinkedIn, Plaxo.
Plaxo, yeah.
Apologies, Plaxo. And then he joined Facebook, and he called me and he said, hey, where are you? I said, I'm in DC. He goes, perfect. I just joined this company called thefacebook.com. I'm here to see my parents, and I brought my boss. You want to meet him? And so in 2005, Parker shows up in my office in Dulles, Virginia, with Zuck, who at the time must have been, I don't know, 19?
Yeah.
And, you know, a caricature out of the movie, like the North Face hoodie, shorts, and flip-flops in the middle of November.
Yeah.
I thought, this guy must be a genius because it's really cold outside. I mean, he must know something the rest of us doesn't know. And so I talked to him. I didn't really think much of it, but I went back to the team and I said, you know, this company is really growing, and it's the next kind of network effect that comes after our network effect in AIM and ICQ. And they basically said, listen, kid, we are in the middle of deconstructing this $100 billion merger. We're not buying anything, but we'll give you the green light to do a business deal with Facebook. So I went to Parker and Zuck and I said, I want to do a deal where we integrate AIM into Facebook. So they didn't have Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp or any of this stuff in 2005 and 6.
Sure.
And so what happened, if you used the product at the time, it was horrible. You can imagine how clunky this looked. You would see this little Running Man logo or ICQ logo beside your name. You would click on it. Our app would pop up, and then you could communicate with people. And at the time, that was relatively novel. But very quickly, the Facebook board said, this is horrible. Get out of this deal. And so Parker called me and said, I have 2 pieces of news. Number 1, I'm leaving the company. Number 2, you need to unwind this deal. So that's how I got to know Zuck at the time. We had to unwind this deal. I was like, okay, if you don't want to do it, we won't do it. And then kind of like, you know, within a year I was working there.
Yeah. I actually have I digress a little bit, but I have a 2005 Facebook story myself. Matt Kohler told me about it and how it was growing, and there was an opportunity to fund it. And before I even bothered Zuck, I wanted to check if there's any chance of doing it within Apex. And of course, within 5 minutes, it was dead on arrival. And this is one of the reasons. There are others, but this is one of the reasons why I never took partners since 2000 and since I left Apex. Just religiously stayed well.
Well, I think you're living proof of a theme in investing that people want to ignore, because it's a little heterodoxical to how society works. But company building is very much a team sport, but investing is not.
Exactly.
And nobody wants to really admit that. I think you can return average returns as a team, but if you want to be a star, you have to do it alone. And that's one of the few things other than an individual sport, like singles tennis as an example, or golf. But to be excellent is fundamentally about you. And that's a hard thing for a lot of people to swallow. I'm actually curious why some people, I think when some people are really turned off by me, I think there's a part of these things that I say that are these truths that are really hiding in plain sight, that are very uncomfortable for orthodoxy to accept. That's not a justification sometimes for some of the other things that I say that can be a little beyond the pale. But I do think that there's a lot of this stuff that really offends people to the core. And it's because it unwinds a lot of their belief system. And it pushes up against conventions that they have bought into, with this little thing in the back of their mind that says it's probably not true. And that's a duality that a lot of people have to deal with. And they don't like to deal with the complicated truth of that.
Yeah, yeah.
That's why you've done so well. I mean, you're an exceptional investor with, I mean, literally exceptional returns. You may have done more. Maybe you could have had more AUM, but you would not have been as impactful as a team. And that is a tough thing for people to swallow and understand.
100%. I know that if I was part of a partnership, I would not do as well.
Right.
100%. So anyway, when you joined Facebook and you spent 4 years there from 2007 to 2011, what was the origin of the growth? Because the whole concept of growth, basically you guys invented, right? The team under you invented. And initially it was called growth hacking and then growth, but can you share a little bit about how everything came about?
In the first year, the executive team was Zuckerberg, Matt Kohler, me, this guy Owen Van Natta, this guy
and Owen, from Amazon.
Yeah, from Amazon. Gideon Yu, who was who had just
49ers later.
He had been the CFO of YouTube, and then had taken a job as a partner at Sequoia, and then untaken the job to join us at Facebook, and a couple of other people. And there was a lot of executive churn at the time, people coming in, people coming out. And I went off to sort of try to help invent the ad business and a bunch of other modalities, including the platform business of Facebook. And in the process of that, we invented some really compelling technology, and you can Google the patents, but if you look at the patents that we were awarded in that period, me, Zuck, a handful of others, but it's a lot of the fundamental underpinnings of Web 2.0. How do you actually do cross-site communications? How do you actually inject JavaScript into somebody else's? Oh, the security guys are freaking out, but I get it. At the time, we all trusted each other, so it was like, it's fine, this is going to happen. But because none of these things were solved problems at the time. So we had to go and solve these things. And in doing that, we implemented an advertising system that we called social actions, where the idea is that you would be perusing a website off of Google. We invented a cookie. We invented the first cookie, okay? We would kind of like cache all this information and we would generate this ad for you. Well, lo and behold, everybody freaked out. There was a person who was browsing engagement rings, and then it showed up on his girlfriend's newsfeed. John is buying an engagement ring at Zales. Then there was a guy that had bought a ticket on a movie to a movie that had offended his coworkers or something. Long and the short of it was we ended up getting sued by like 13 state attorneys general, and we were accused of stealing information or whatever. And I tried to go to the New York Times to try to explain it. And that backfired. So it was a moment of deep skepticism and negativity internally, both about me and my effectiveness and my role, but also the company. How could we make money? How do we move beyond ads? And so I said, okay, I'm going to throw this Hail Mary. There's a guy on my team, Alex Schultz, who's now the CMO, who said, Chamath, we need to think about how we grow this business and make back some of this theoretical damage. And I sat with Alex and he explained a lot of this stuff to me. And look, a lot of my life is being lucky enough to be around these smart people where for me it's about taking what they say, embracing it and extending it a little bit more. And what we developed was this idea of having a hyper-aggressive approach to expanding the network and the density of the graph. And I went and I pitched it at the board. And I said, and then I remember the day before or something, Cheryl called me and we walked through the plan. She's like, well, what are you going to call this thing? Because we need to name this thing. And it's like, I don't know, we have to grow this thing because it's not growing. And she said, okay, you'll be the VP of growth. And I said, okay. And that's how it started. So very humble beginnings. And in the first 6 or 9 months, or nothing happened. Because I would bring a team about half the size of this team together, engineers, product managers, designers. And every Wednesday, I would say, okay, what experiments did you run? What have you figured out? And for the first 6 months, it was much of nothing. And so it didn't feel like things were working. And then all of a sudden, just the things started to accumulate. And we learned, look, Albert Einstein said, the greatest thing that's really been invented is compound interest, right? Like it's really the 8th wonder of the world. And we saw it in real time in front of our eyes. 10 basis points here, 5 basis points there, 7 basis points here. And my mind clicked because that made sense to me, probabilistically more of an investing mindset. So it really became, to me, the next 3 years was purely about me allocating capital, I felt like. I'm an investor, I'm making bets, some things become unicorns, something becomes duds, and it manifested in a bunch of different products. A lot of it ended up working. And then, it came to a point where I said, and then obviously, I got in the way of some things as well. And it was a moment to decide I either stay and invest, which was a complicated decision to say no to because there was a lot of money on the table, or I leave, and I chose to leave. As Dave Chappelle said, I got off the bus.
But on good terms at that point.
At that point, it was great. What had happened was we had tried to build a phone, and I had taken a team off to go and build an operating system. And an actual physical implementation, and like a physical form factor. It was quite unique in the moment, but it was caught up in a lot of my own issues as a human being and trying to come to terms with the fact that, to be very honest, this is ultimately Zuck's company and his decisions, and I mattered, but really not that much, And I had to really internalize that was true, and that if I wanted to have my real stamp and make decisions, it would have to be my own thing. And so I asked them if they would support me to leave. They were very kind. They gave me some initial capital. And then I raised a bunch more, and I started Social Capital. And it's been amazing. These last 12 years have been really, truly amazing for me, personally.
And that's more or less when we met the first time, when we started with Social Capital, or maybe a year or two later. And when you started as a more conventional, I don't know, conventional doesn't go.
Very conventional. And you're saying the key thing. I didn't believe in myself. And I fundamentally, and this goes to explain why some of the people that sent you an email, they can take a snapshot of me and say, I don't like that guy. But what they're seeing probably in that moment is me feeling really insecure about myself and saying or doing something to try to just get attention. But really it's an attempt for me to make myself feel better. And so when I started as a kid with 0 credentials, immigrant to the United States, I didn't go to Harvard, I didn't go to Stanford, I didn't have any of these things. I thought I needed to look like everybody else in order to succeed. And so the first version of Social Capital was my attempt to copy everybody else. And so, when you first met me, I thought, okay, well, I don't have an MBA, so I need to recruit somebody with an MBA. Yeah. I don't have these connections to traditional LPs. I need to have that. I wanted to go and invest in, Bitcoin in 2011, but instead I was, doing very traditional. People were asking me, what's the next app after Instagram? And then at some point I said, no, I got to really start to do this for myself. And so I started to make these small bets, which really spoke to my own internal voice. And when those things started to work out, I had the courage to really stick to that. And that's a really important challenge. It's both a challenge for the entrepreneur and the investor, because you get signals that will always... Startups, by definition, are heterodoxical. Because if it was already solved and it was already part of the common logic, the lingua franca of how the world works, you would not have an opportunity. So by definition, you are going to have an entire system that tells you this isn't working. An investor is the same thing, because now you have to identify with those people and those ideas that are, again, heterodoxical and often to the fringes, and figure out a way to embrace it and move it into the center. So you have very few moments where you feel like the signal is true, and an infinite number of occasions where everybody is telling you you're wrong. So what do you do? And that is a process that I was able to go through. And you need those feedback loops. You need to fail quickly enough, and you need to get enough successes early enough to give you confidence, at least for me, because I didn't have the intestinal fortitude to stick it out. I would have crumbled to the will of the masses without it. You know, at one point in 2011, I owned 5% of all the Bitcoins in circulation. And I thought to myself, I sound like an idiot. And I went to Mike Bloomberg, who was a mentor of mine. I said, can I write this op-ed for you? And he's like, yeah, sure, whatever. Bitcoin, I have no idea what this is. Just write it. And I was like, you know, everybody should basically have 1% of their portfolio allocated to this. And I just remember how dumb I was made to feel whenever I went to New York. And every time I would go on CNBC in the early 2000s, you can see these clips on YouTube, they treated me so poorly. And I had to defend myself almost as a person. They would show this clip of Charlie Munger and Gates and Buffett, who are my heroes, not Gates so much, but Buffett and Munger are my heroes, saying that stuff is like rat poison. And then, you're a rat poison, and you have to defend yourself. You know how hard that is? It's really
And
hard.
this was still while you still had the partners. So I'm interested. I can write a book about partnership dynamics, and I'm curious how things when you did your things, and maybe your partners are doing more conventional things. I'm guessing. I don't know. You tell me. But how did it affect the partnership dynamics and what And you had a pretty good run, and then you basically shut it down. And so the LPs probably were not happy. I'm assuming. I don't know. But so how did, if you don't mind sharing? By the way, so far it's been incredibly candid. I'm much more than typically is. So again, this is Chamath. This is
So
this is very, very special. But yeah,
I raised Fund 1. It was a $300 million fund, and it was going well. But the early bets that looked like they were working were in crypto and actually in SaaS, because there was a really good friend of mine called David Sachs who runs this thing called Yammer, and David was running out of money in June of 2011. I had just left Facebook, and I was in Las Vegas playing poker for the entire month. And he called me, and he's like, I need money. And I'm like, well, how much money do you need? He's like, I don't know, I need like $15, $16 million. I said, it'll be in your account tomorrow morning. So I wired the money so I could go back to playing poker. And then I said, you're just going to have to explain this thing to me because I didn't understand what Yammer was. It sounded like something
Neither did Microsoft.
It's like a sleeping aid. It's like, So I come back to Silicon Valley at the end of that summer. I go to see David, and meticulously he takes the time to explain to me. And the biggest aha moment was my takeaway is David is building superior software, but my real takeaway was he could build inferior software because the delivery mechanism was so much better that his basically cost structure would allow him to build a company that was materially cheaper than any equivalent traditional enterprise company. And that was the first real thing that I saw in the cloud, was 2011. So when we raised Fund 2, we pushed the whole partnership to focus on cloud. 2013, and our big bet there was Slack. But then we started to make some small bets in deep tech. And then by 2015, we raised Fund 3. It was a $500 million fund. So, everything is all good so far. But I was like, we got to push this team now towards this other area. And we're the only two meaningful investors in now SpaceX and Relativity Space, which is the second most valuable space company. And we did a drone business. We pulled a team out of Google that built their AI chip to build a new business called Grok. So a lot of deep tech stuff. And then at the end of Fund 3, I was seeing the same pattern. But my team was exhausted. They were born and bred in a more traditional framing of, I worked at an enterprise SaaS company. I'm here to do enterprise SaaS deals. I worked at a consumer business. I worked at a healthcare IT business. Now, that's all fine and good for a team approach, but I had defined winning in a very different way. Now, in fairness to them, I didn't tell them what winning was. And that was my fault, and that's on me. And just to be clear what winning is, there's a famous person, Stan Druckenmiller. I would encourage you to listen to him because I think that he has the most prescient modern view of it. Basically, the way that like investing works is there's momentum investing. That could be a lot of Silicon Valley in the 2000s, I think 2010s, okay? Then there's sort of like P&L investing. You look at cash flows, money in, money out. Then there's macro investing, which is really about how these systems of government and institutions work together. And then there's the philosophical investing, where the absolute greats don't care about any of this stuff. They see a philosophy. They have a system. And I think Stan is one of those guys. So the point is, you know, when you looked at guys like that, they were constantly moving. And they were constantly pushing themselves to retool their skill set. And what they were really good at was managing risk, entry point, making sure that you generated returns. And so I said, I need to prove this to myself. I had used all of this infrastructure around me as a crutch. I had never been in the in the wilderness alone, naked, afraid. I had to do it. And so when I made this decision, I did this other crazy decision. I took $1.5 billion and I said, here's of my money, fund 4, this is it, I'm on the hook, every single dollar now, I have to figure out what to do with. And the craziest thing happened. The returns in the last 3 years have been better than all the other funds before it.
I'm not surprised, given my experience. Yeah.
And they were bigger. So the funds were bigger, the returns were better. And so it proved to me that that job, not a lot of people may respect or look up to. That's okay. I have always. And so what I realized is this business, Oren, looks more like your business than it looks like a 300-person team business. That optimization is a different one, which actually benefits all of you. Getting money from him is actually much harder than getting money from a 300-person organization. He's more likely to make you successful than a 300-person organization, but it's a trade-off because at some point you may take one over the other, right? But this business is a very different business than that business. But those businesses are also really important because they do something else exceptionally well that you and I can't do. Sure.
So now in 2007, right, when did you, 17 more or less?
Yeah.
And at some point you get ahead of anyone else that I know of, get really interested in SPACs. Because I remember you pitching me SPACs in the context of house back in, I think it was 2017, more or less, 17, 18, I don't know. So definitely you were ahead of the curve on that one. And you didn't just ride this wave, you arguably created this wave, right? Fair to say?
Yeah, not partly.
So now in hindsight, what do you think today, looking back, what do you think today of all this SPAC craze? What went right? What went wrong? Do you have any regrets? How do you feel about it?
No regrets, but I've learned a lot, and here's what I'll tell you. I think the SPAC is going to be a really important tool in the arsenal of entrepreneurs. Look, the thing right now is you guys, when you're ready to go public, well, actually, let me take a step back. We did a massive disservice to you because we told you that you should never go public. That was stupid and dumb. And that feedback was actually a lie that was a reflection of our own insecurity in the 2010s. We were young, we were dilettantes, we didn't want to be held accountable to bad behavior. That's mostly the summary of most of these internet companies. Because by the time they went public, if you go and look at the public statements, they all said the opposite. I wish I'd gone public sooner. Well, what secret did they realize by going public? That at some point when you have a nominal amount of scale, the key to winning is your cost of capital. So let me just explain what that means. At the end of the day, when you have product market fit, you want as many dollars as you can get your hands on to pound into the machinery to make that thing scale. Well, you want to do that with the least amount of dilution, with the least amount of overhang to your balance sheet. And so being public is something that should actually be pulled forward in the life cycle of a company. And that is how Silicon Valley used to work. In the 90s, you used to go public unprofitably when it was a $200, $300, or $400 million market cap. People forget. Yeah. Amazon, Google, and Microsoft collectively only raised $125 million before they went public. I'm going to repeat that. Amazon, Google, and Microsoft only raised $125 million before they went public. They were not waiting for some moment of perfection. But by being public, what that allowed them to do was basically explain their business to people who had very different expectations on the rates of return that they wanted. Because when you sell a public market investor, their alternative is to buy a 10-year bond that yields today 4%. So 10% looks amazing, 15% looks outrageous, 20% looks just illegal to them. Whereas the opposite is true as private investors. You need to grow by 100%, otherwise you're failing, quote unquote. You're not failing. So to me, in year 7 of the cycle, it was clear to me that we as an organization needed to be net sellers of equities in the market. I could not keep waiting and having billions of dollars of imputed value in our book where none of it was liquid. That was insane to me. And so when I saw the SPAC, I was like, this is a very clever tool. It helps companies that are really capital intensive. It helps explain very complicated businesses. It's a different way of building relationships with these people that can then give you hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. Now, SPACs, like IPOs, have had good outcomes. They've also had bad outcomes. But in the future of time, you will evaluate these things, and now you'll have a traditional IPO, a direct listing, and a SPAC that you can use to get money. And some of you who are doing very hard things will find a SPAC as a way of raising $1 billion in the less dilutive way possible. Some of you who are running a software business with 90% gross margins may decide a $50 million IPO is enough. To each their own. But the optionality should be there because it will give you the ability to negotiate against the financial infrastructure. It will cause you to have less dilution. You will be more in power. That is better. And I think that's what we started. And I think that there'll be more innovations along that over time.
Do you think there will? First of all, it's interesting to hear that you're still bullish about SPACs. Do you think that there were some, I think, at least that's my opinion, there were some flaws in the way it was designed because there were elements of a pyramid scheme built into it. Do you think that we'll see some new version of SPACs that would fix the wrongs?
I think the most disruptive idea now is like for somebody, let's say you, so that take me out of it, where you go and you raise a $250 million SPAC where $249 million of it is yours, and $1 million of it is a bunch of other investors, just so that you qualify for the SEC's rules that they have. And then when you go to a company, you're like, the money's guaranteed. Here's a $250 million IPO. Let's agree on a price, you and me, that's fair. Let's negotiate executive comp. Let's negotiate the dilution package for the execs. Let's negotiate how much other money you may need from other people. And then you do it. That single change, I think, is extremely powerful. Now, you need to be well capitalized to do that, but I do think that that's a powerful idea. So that single innovation is meaningful. At the end of the day, people get caught up in the promote a lot, but the reality is, like, you know, you're going to pay 6% of your company in an IPO to the banks. Now, maybe that may be problematic because you have to pay an individual person, but you can negotiate that. It won't be 6%. Maybe it'll be 3%. Maybe
6% of the money raised, not the company.
6% of the money raised, yeah.
Okay. By the way, back to crypto. Then, you know, are you still bullish? Are you deterred at all by, you know, the recent, you know, some meltdown, and admittedly the same happened in the stock market, and we don't have any concerns that the stock market is going to come back at some point. Do you have any such concerns about crypto? Not really.
No, I think that in the long run, it's a system that makes sense. But I think in the short run, crypto is not dissimilar to SPACs, which is that there was a mania that cheap money fueled a lot of market arbitrage. A lot of this DeFi stuff was a scam. There's been a lot of token sales that are, you know, really not appropriate. I think the SEC has to go and clean a lot of that stuff up. But the remnants of that industry, I think, are real. And I think Bitcoin as a store of value is really real. I still believe in Bitcoin.
Okay. Good. I have 2 Bitcoins.
I have 2 trillion. I don't. I wish I did.
No, I'm not gonna compete with you based on who owns more Bitcoin. I'm gonna miserably lose. Anyway, now we actually didn't discuss it, but do you have something new now that
Well,
you're working on? Like someone told me, like a new idea, fun, something.
Well, so these last few years, talking about sort of like really honing, I just wanted to tell you about 2 trends that I think are very important for you to understand, which is the reason why I'm raising Fund 5 and actually partnering now with other people. But let me tell you the trends. I think that there are 2 incredible things, and I've said this a little bit, so maybe I can explain it. Number 1 is, what all of you need to understand is that the marginal cost of energy is going to 0. So let me just explain that really briefly. If you today go back to your home, you pay PG&E some prevailing rate for energy generation. If you actually look at your bill, you may have noticed that that bill has compounded by between 3 and 11% a month over the last decade, and it will compound at 3 to 11% a month for the next decade. And the reason is not because it costs that much more money to make the energy. In fact, making the energy is 0. You stick a solar panel up on your roof and you stick a battery wall, it's 0. What costs money is that there is an exchange that these utilities have signed up for. The government has said, I will give you monopoly pricing power, but I'm going to hold you accountable and make sure that you spend some amount of money on a regular basis. So in California, as an example, PG&E is going to spend $200 billion upgrading the power lines, which are like 40 and 50 years old. They have, seawalls to protect the Diablo nuclear reactor. They have turbines that are broken. All of that stuff is incredibly inefficient. It doesn't work. It causes lots of outages. It's not available all the time. And that results in the rising cost of that. But at the same time, we as an American society has decided we don't want to fight wars anymore. We don't want to fight wars, particularly over resources. And there is a way to make, resource abundance a practical thing. The last 3 bills in America that have passed, the BIL, the CHIPS Act, and the IRA, has essentially created $750 billion of incentives to get the cost of energy to 0. So you as a consumer in the next few, months literally, will be able to sign up for a lease product, $30, $40, $50 a month, that is guaranteed to always be 30 to 40% cheaper than your utility, and somebody in 30 days will come and stick solar panels on your roof and a battery system. And by law, every ounce of energy you don't use, you'll be allowed to sell back into the grid where PG&E has to pay you. So all of a sudden, 100 million people in the home are going to compete with the 1,700 utilities in America. That's going to turn the entire energy infrastructure of this country upside down. It'll make energy so abundant and so free that now you can use that energy for all kinds of impractical ideas that are now going to move into the realm of the practical. That's a huge idea. It touches batteries, it touches the supply chain, it touches rare earths, it touches critical metals, it touches control infrastructure, software, hardware, data centers, everything. And then separately, the cost of compute is basically going to 0. And the reason is that you cannot think about Moore's law and transistor density anymore. It's irrelevant. You have to think of teraflops and compute capacity. And that has been linearly compounding so that you can see that it effectively doubles also between every 18 and 24 months. And the reason is because we're using more ASICs, more GPUs, more FPGAs, and all of that stuff you can write to now in Amazon and GCP and Azure simply. If you take those 2 things together and you multiply them, it is nuts the kind of problems you can solve. When OpenAI raised $1 billion from Microsoft, they took that money and they bought compute and data center capacity. They had to pay huge power bills and huge compute bills, and think of what they created. Incredible stuff. DALL-E, GPT-3. That $1 billion of spend will be like $1 million of spend in less than 10 years. So if you spend $1 billion 10 years from now, you will accomplish 1,000 times more than what those models were able to generate. Well, what problem do you want to solve? There's a lot of people that'll be running around with $1 billion, who can fund things. Governments, NGOs, foundations, companies, right? VCs. So when I really internalize that, I started to put together sort of like a 10-year investing plan. At the end of it, the honest takeaway, Oren, is that as an individual, I just couldn't do it on my own. I would have done it on my own, but I couldn't do it for the ambition that I have to be at the edge of helping that. I needed to partner with organizations, and specifically I wanted to partner with governments and large institutions that have a real need for this. So I'll give you one example. If you take the cost of energy and the cost of compute going to zero, the most interesting human problem that I would like to help solve is a computational biology one. So if you shift the realm of disease-solving ideas away from labs and away from in vitro or in vivo speculation to in silico speculation, what you can do is essentially now start to build a human body model in silicon, and you can try to do drug discovery in a completely different way. You can literally brute force simulate 10 to the 33 molecules. You can figure out every single permutational combination of every single human protein in the human body. Does anybody know what that will solve? None of us knows, but we have a right to find that out. But I need to partner with those institutions who can write a 10 or 15 or $20 billion check. I can write some amount of that, and so that's why I thought Fund 5 made sense. And
So it's Fund 5 basically focused on energy. Is
energy,
what I'm hearing?
well, energy transition, life sciences, and deep tech are sort of like the three that I
Got
think
it.
are these massive megatrends.
Okay, I have one last quick question. Then if we have time, I'm going to let the audience. You had like a 24-hour, maybe 48-hour political career running for governor, right? Until you didn't. So any chance we'll see you in politics at some point?
I have found that the leveraged way is to really be a part of this process more constructively. And the best way to do that, I found quite honestly right now, is by donating a meaningful amount of capital, which I do every cycle. I think there's an FEC filing that'll drop in the next couple of days about what I just did in this cycle. It allows me to be a constructive part of this dialogue more than doing that. I think that I saw a burst of antibodies, and it was an important check for me to say, do you really want that, or are you just doing this? And it was a point of growth for me, where I was like, yet another data point that says, hey, hold on a second, get your ego in check and do your job. Are you an investor, or are you trying to be a politician? No, I'm an investor.
Yeah, no, I can identify with that.
Yeah.
So, right, Yasmin, how much time do we have? 10 minutes. Okay. Anyone has a question? No way, come on. I can think of... Yes. Yes.
Do you think... Hi, thank you. I'm Stephanie. When you reflect back on your career and how you started, how much do you think your network played a role, and like the kind of, not luck, but just kind of like...
I think luck is a very good word, and I would say enormous. I'm a beneficiary of huge tailwinds that I did not create, but bumbled my way into. I'm 46 years old, and so I'm sandwiched between two ginormous population cohorts, boomers above me, and these millennial Gen Zs below me, not hierarchically, take it easy, woke millennials. These freaking millennials. Such clowns. But if you look at a population pyramid, the other generation of people that benefited from that was Buffett's generation, where he had the silent generation above him and the boomers beneath him. That turns out to be enormously advantageous when you're building your career, because the population set that you compete with for your jobs in your 20s and 30s is non-existent. And so I think I benefited from that. I had a technical degree from Canada, and they had negotiated a free trade agreement with the United States, and all of you guys who have emigrated probably have felt this. It is really hard to come here as an immigrant, particularly now. But I was able to walk across the border, show them my degree, and I got a temporary NAFTA visa. That had nothing to do with me, so I benefited from that. My girlfriend at the time was here in California. I bumbled my way to California, and I got a job at a startup. How did you know that tech was going to be that important? I didn't know. And so in those moments, it's like you're multiplying these things together. I was hugely lucky. And then my network also benefited from those same things. We were a few people that got the pick of the jobs, and we were able to take advantage of that. So it is deeply advantageous to have had those tailwinds at my back that had nothing to do with me.
Well, I guess to add to that, if I can, then what do you see, I guess, for like this next kind of, the next sandwich generation? What do you see?
I think that the sandwich generation below is immensely frustrated, but doesn't actually understand that in the next 10 or 15 years, they're going to become enormously rich because their parents are going to die. And that may sound morbid, but it's the actual mathematical truth of it all. You have a very, very small population of boomers in the grand scheme of the world who control one entire turn of global GDP. They have $85 trillion of assets. And so these, 50-odd, 75-odd million Americans are going to hand that to 100 million American kids. So when you get that amount of wealth transfer, it's going to enable people to be extremely resourceful and productive. This is why I think like all of these indirections, like wokeism and all of this other stuff, you're not training for the right game. What you should be really training for is the inheritance of the capital. No, honestly, I mean, I'm not saying that to be dumb or flippant, but like, think of what happens if you're ill-prepared and all of a sudden a parent gives you tens of millions of dollars multiplied by 100 million people. So it can either veer towards consumerism or it can veer towards entrepreneurialism. There's really only one of two outcomes. And so I would hope that people are training for the latter outcome, not the former outcome.
Yes, over there.
Hi, thanks for being here. Means a lot to all of us. Lots of Israelis in the audience. By the way, the reason you're not getting any questions, because Israelis know everything. But you were actually in the Israeli tech ecosystem before most of us, with this ICQ. Have you missed out on Israel? Has Israel missed out on you? How come you've not done as much as others have done in Israel? Maybe you've done and we just don't know about it. And what do you think in general about Israel's role in the global innovation ecosystem?
Well, I think that the knock against Israeli startups has always been that they're very good in the lower levels of the stack. So if you look at the OSI stack, just as a framework where the application level is here, and you have the physical layer all the way here, Israeli startups were really good here because they were fundamentally technical problem-solving kinds of companies, and that this kind of like adding elements of like psychological optimization in products really didn't matter that much. And you still see that for the most part today, where the really big outcomes, and I would probably put right at the top of like, I think like Palo Alto Networks is a great one, These are like very technical problems that are being solved. And so there has been a training that has made Israelis deeply reliable in that skill set. Over time, in order to sort of migrate up the stack, if you will, I think you have to have a much more diversified and almost randomized approach to how people are educated, to how people just consume information, content, how they live their lives. And that's been easier to do in places like the United States because it is a place that has enjoyed for the last 75 years a peace dividend. And I think that you shouldn't underestimate that. And that's a tailwind. Does the Jack Dorseys of the world exist in Israel? Absolutely. But not with the same boundary conditions. And so I think over time, though, my belief is every country is essentially going to get to energy independence over the next 30 years. And I think like war doesn't make sense anymore. And I think this is a very heterodoxical view because like the military industrial complex doesn't want that to happen. But if we don't fight over natural resources, what are you really going to fight over? And the surface area of that gets more and more limited as people, don't stratify themselves by borders, but stratify themselves in different ways. So it's happening, I think. The next TikTok will be in Israel, is my point. It just, you know what I mean? Like it's...
The next question is here.
Here, maybe Lee?
Oh, here, there's a guy, Oren, there's a guy there.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, Gal from Oligo. You mentioned before that at first you didn't believe in yourself. What helped you overcome this impersonate syndrome?
I still don't. And I think that this is the journey of the person who is trying to achieve a lot is, unfortunately, as I've seen it, really, really well-balanced people don't necessarily believe that there's such a need to keep achieving. And I think that they find happiness much better. I'm sure you have friends like that. I have friends like that. I'm very envious of them. The reason I keep going after this phantom ghost that I'm chasing is because I don't believe in myself. And I think that if I slay that ghost or if I achieve that thing, it will solve all the problems. And I know the joke. The joke is that it doesn't solve anything, but I keep chasing it. So, you know, I don't know what that means. I'm still running on the treadmill, but I'm at least more conscious of that and those trade-offs. I kind of justify it to myself as, what else would I do? And I think that that's okay. But it explains why a lot of folks are just become so maniacally driven. They're trying to fill a hole inside them. And I'm trying to learn how to look at my kids and have them fill my hole, to look at my wife and have it fill my hole. It's just, that sounded bad. You know what I'm trying to say? You know what I mean? That's what I mean.
Hi, Danny from Nidus. I apologize, it's going to be a very fintech nerdy question. But you said before that you were still a big believer in Bitcoin and also that energy is going to be very abundant very soon. So how do you reconcile that and how do you see that affecting, like, in terms of mining, decentralization, and the crypto markets?
Well, look, let me just say this about fintech. I think that many businesses very much worked well and looked elegant at zero interest rates. And I think we have to go through a sorting function when rates are non-zero. So there's a lot of businesses that I think will have a very difficult time. In the case of Bitcoin, I don't think it's a financial asset. I don't think it's a transactional asset. I think it's basically just an alternative store of value. It could be a bushel of hay. It could be a bag of acorns. It could be diamonds. And I think that's how one should view it. And the terminal cost of producing that almost doesn't matter because it eventually will get imputed and reflected in the price. But also the value that it represents in the economy will be so much greater than the actual terminal value of creating it. A lot of people today get caught up in the whole mining thing and all of that. I would just like, I would not even worry about it. I personally think you own it. If you can dollar cost average into it, it's better. I don't think there's a real structural business in mining this stuff. I think it's a very cost plus business that is not that remunerative. At best, it's speculative. It works in random rate regimes that you can't predict a priori. That's kind of what I think.
All right, I have a question. Thanks for doing this, Oren and Chamath. This has been very refreshing and insightful, completely different dimensions. This is awesome. I have a question around the current market dynamics and what do you look for lately, right? I mean, you've invested in a lot of consumer-driven tech and all of that. But these days, when you're looking at making investments, what are some of the criteria you look at? I mean, has that been constant over the years or have things changed or what is your perspective on that?
My largest investment has been in an energy transition business that's effectively trying to empower 100 million homeowners to compete against the 1,700 utilities. It's almost a $300 million investment at this point. It's doing well. I believe in it. I hope it can really get to scale. When I invested in it, it was the 8th largest business in its category. At the end of this year, it'll be the 3rd largest. Within 3 years, maybe we have a chance of being the 2nd or the 1st. But it's a purely a software kind of play, which is about owning the relationship with the customer. So I believe in that kind of market. I've made a bunch of investments in life sciences. Again, trying to learn about this movement away from in vitro and in vivo testing to in silico. learning about gene editing, learning about, just a simple example, but like, if you look at the head of rare diseases, right, the 400 top most reoccurring rare diseases in the world, half of them are because of one single point mutation between a C and a T, a mismethylation between C and T. So if you can basically go in and base edit that one C back to a T, you solve half of the most prevalent rare diseases in the world. I don't know what a life of a human is worth, but it's probably more than a per seat license you can get for Slack. And so, you can make trillions of dollars from that stuff, right? So I'm focused, I've made some investments there. But mostly I've just been observing and trying to clarify my point of view because it's an extremely chaotic moment. I try to remind the companies that I work with, we're at the beginning of the beginning here. We may be at the end of the bottoming cycle, but we're at the beginning of the beginning. We have not lived through a rate regime where you have consistent 4.5%, 5% rates. There's going to be some extreme positive outcomes. The really good companies here will be able to recruit people away from the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons of the world. The really good companies here will be able to raise money still on your own terms while your competitors cannot, even if you take a small down round. It doesn't matter. And just to remind you, in 2008, in the middle of the great financial crisis, within a 9-month period, we raised money from Microsoft at Facebook at $15.3 billion, and then from Yuri Milner at DST at 8.5. So it happens to the best of us. Now that was so you shouldn't be ashamed of that. The thing that you should care about is the relatively how screwed your competitors are. Because if they're more screwed than you are, so much the better. So I think a lot about that, right? We've had 3 enormous cataclysmic changes in 9 months. 3. Have you ever lived in a time where you've seen that? And you're shocked into this because you don't know. You've had the end of zero interest rates. You've had the beginning of a land war in Europe. And now you've had the passage of enormous sets of legislation that essentially ensures, I think, this peace dividend all around the world. So you just got to brace yourself for things that are going to break, in my opinion. And that's what we're doing. Bracing for impact.
Donna?
Piggybacking on that, there's a lot of startups in the room, and I work with startups. What is your take now on funding and what the state of the market is going to do for startups and the funding round? What would you advise founders that are now looking to raise?
I'm about to do this blog post on what I call correlation. I went into PitchBook and I pulled the 400 deals that we've done since the beginning of time. A bunch of big deals and a bunch of very small deals. And then I pulled all of the PitchBook data for every other VC. And you can name them all. And I asked my team a simple question. When we do a deal, how often are any of these folks doing it at the same time or after us? Vice versa. And then answer that question for everybody else as well. And what you find is that there is an enormous amount of correlation amongst VCs here. They're all trafficking in the same stuff. Now, why is that important for you? It's that when you see a drawdown, so back to this question, it's going to hit everybody except the ones that are uncorrelated. They will be in a position to write capital. There are some firms whose correlation is off the charts. 15% of their deals are literally just doing every deal that Benchmark does. 9% of their same deals are what Sequoia does. Now, you would say, well, that's what you should do. It turns out that's not what you should do as an early stage VC. It's what the late stage folks should do. Late stage folks should have 100% correlation, right? If you're Tiger and Coatue and et cetera, of course you should be picking from these deals. But if you're early stage and you're copying a bunch of other early stage people, you're just repeating the same risk over and over again. And you need new risk in order to stay independent. Otherwise, you're not going to be in a position to be able to write new checks. I'll publish this blog post because it's instructive. You should probably do a reverse sort on the correlation index, because the people that are zero are the people you should go to first, because they'll have the least damage in their portfolio. They'll be the least impaired, and they'll be in a position to write checks. But over the next 6, 9, 12 months, when all of these valuations start to flow through everybody's, K1s, LPs will start asking questions. The most correlated VCs are going to be the ones that are feeling it the most. Doesn't mean they're bad people, but they had a miscalculation, which is they confused alpha and beta. This is alpha. When you're uncorrelated, it's alpha. When you are correlated with everybody else and when the market goes up, you go up, that's beta. And that is really good when rates are zero and the market's ripping. But it's really terrible when rates are not zero and the market is not ripping.
It's correlation, it's also concentration, because when you're very diversified, you're better.
We'll do one last question.
Hi, Lee again. First of all, I just want to say thank you for being vulnerable in this conversation. It's very refreshing as an entrepreneur to see a VC be, and someone in your shoes just be open like that. And I hope more investors open up in this vulnerability element. My question is, what role does fear still play in your life?
Yeah, I mean, look, unfortunately, more than it should, I think. I don't know whether it's like growing up. I felt I grew up in a war zone in my house. My house was a war zone. I had to evade my father to survive. So I was very hyper-vigilant as a kid. So I became hyper-aware. I became hyper-detail-oriented. I became hyper everything. And that's all rooted in fear, because you don't want to be at the receiving end of that kind of physical and emotional damage. So it's too latent for me to really tell you how much of what I do. When I make mistakes, it's probably a lot of fear and insecurity and all of that stuff. When I don't, and I'm well grounded, it feels phenomenal. When the best thing that I have is I see my kids, and they have none of that. They could not fear me for a fucking second. And I just think it's delicious. It's amazing. So unfortunately, it is just part of me. But I have the luck of being around people that it's not a part of them. And I'm a little part of that not being a part of them. So, it's a lot of fear of failure and fear of not being loved and fear of not accomplishing and fear of being a loser. And yeah, it's a lot all the time.
Well, there are many people with questions, so I'm sorry to disappoint everyone. We promise we're going to finish on time. But thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, guys. Oren, thank you.
Thank you so much. Really, thank you.
Amazing.